You've always been so great to work with, and I've learned so many things from you. It's a treat for me to be here with women in big data. So very excited about that. I've got a long tenure in sales at this point, and Shuchi asked me to talk a little bit about sales. So we broke it up into three different areas, kind of sales 101, enterprise sales, and value-based selling. And I've been an individual contributor in sales, managed sales teams, worked with sales teams across an entire region and so on. So we'll help talk a little bit from an entrepreneur perspective, how important sales is not only to founders that are starting companies, but obviously large organizations that are selling as well. So that's the goal, to share this with you today. And I understand you can put some questions in the chat, and we'll try and get to them, little breaking points, and definitely at the end as well. So with that, let's get started here. So the first thing, maybe we should start, sales 101, assumption about sales. Customers buy your product. It's kind of where everyone starts, right? And we're just going to call product a product or service with differentiated value from your competitor. When I got into sales, first sales training class, the person was like, that was leading it, was a great sales teacher and mentor to me. And he's like, look, if you're selling a commodity, you should change companies right away, right? Because great salespeople really have the ability to differentiate the value from their competitors, and this is a big part. So we're going to talk about a product as if that's the case, that it's got some differentiated value from your competitors. So this is the assumption: customers buy your product. So let's look at this first thing here, customers. I always find it interesting, you see salespeople come and present, and they show the logo slide as if Headspin has actually bought something from them directly, right? But when I think about it, really it's the people at these companies that have been buying things from us. And I almost feel like the logo slide should look something more like this, right? That these people at these companies are buying something from us. So let's just make a quick little change to this first assumption, right? People are actually buying your product at these companies. So a little more fun, let's talk a little bit about your product. Of course, it's got great features, and you have a very exciting founder, and you have a cool HQ with pinball machines, clearly. And have you seen your investors? I mean, they're really good, and you're a market disruptor for sure. And I'm sure your product is the next platform. But let's slow down for a second, and let's just call that sales and marketing narcissism. Because if we are selling to the people that we're trying to have use our product and service, we should be really thinking about them, right? So why do people do anything? They're really making decisions to affect their happiness. And that can really come in kind of two different sides of the same coin, right? They're either trying to alleviate some form of pain, or they're trying to increase their pleasure or happiness. And in the business world, if we're thinking about kind of business to business sales, which we're all spending a lot of time in, a lot of that happiness is kind of measured in financial terms. And you'll see me talking about this a little when we get into the value side of things, of selling to Excel, right, and spreadsheets. So let's always think about this in terms of people are buying your product to be happy or happier. And let's think about it in the business realm, where a lot of these alleviate pains are trying to reduce expense, or from a positive perspective, increase revenue for our customers. So let's modify this statement a little more here. People buy your product to be happy. I'm gonna spend a little bit of time here because it's about sales, right? So people aren't really buying your product necessarily without ever talking to sales people. And Cialdini has this book about the psychology of persuasion. I find this book just super fascinating, and so I'm going to take you through some of the ideas behind it. And on most days, I think it's a very fun book, and certain days, I think it's just frightening, the ability to persuade people using some like natural tendencies that people have. So let's go through some of these, and we'll talk about how salespeople can try and influence you. So the first one is social proof. And this is following the proof of others. And an example of this is, have you ever been in a kind of a session like this, and the founder or the presenter, asks you a question and asks, the folks to raise their hand, right? And what you'll see is people kind of start looking around the room before they do anything to see what others are doing, right? And that's a really great example of social proof, right? People have a natural tendency to follow the proof of others. And you can see sales folks use this all the time with things like reference calls as an example, right? So a great salesperson early in the process is going to try and get you on a reference call so that you can start seeing that other people are proving out that their capability delivers the value that it's supposed to. So social proof is kind of this first persuasion technique. The next one is reciprocation. And this one's an interesting one. It's this idea that somebody's going to give you something ahead of time and then eventually come behind it and ask you for something afterwards. And this is not the same as like bribery or something very corrupt, right? It's not like paying for an outcome. This is really somebody kind of doing you a favor without you having asked for it. And then behind the scene, what you'll find is those people that have been on the other side of it, that have had someone do this favor for them, they are more likely to do what that person is about to ask them to do, right? So you'll see salespeople, great salespeople, very often being super helpful about things, right? They're going to try and help you get things done before they come back for an ask. And so this is a very widely used tool of salespeople. Even little things, maybe like taking you out to lunch or so, are potentially little influencing techniques in the area of reciprocation. The third one is consistency and commitment. This is a very interesting one. When you as a person identify with the kind of person who does fill in the blank, right? Let's call it X, right? You'll seek to reinforce that idea by doing more of X, right? And so I think this is a really interesting one. Whenever you hear a salesperson, let's say we've got a bunch of founders on this call as an example, we found, if I'm a salesperson, I might start it off like, we found founders who are very successful do this, right? Why would I start off a sentence like that if I'm a salesperson? It's because I'm trying to get folks to identify themselves as successful founders. They're gonna then hear me tell them that these successful founders do something a certain way. That natural tendency is for a person to do that same thing because they want to be a successful founder, right? So this is a very interesting influencing technique. And you hear this even in politics, right? Whenever you hear identity politics, right, what they're doing is they're putting people into a group that they want folks to identify with. And it's a persuasion technique. The fourth one is a big one for B2B sales. It's this concept of liking. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this one. The psychology behind it is you are more likely to do something if someone you care about asks you to do it, right? So this is why liking is important, because if you like someone, your psychology is you're more likely to do something with them when they ask you. There's a few tips on actually being more likable, which are these next few points here that I find very interesting. So people will like you more if you tell them good news. And so this is great, right? Like if you are a salesperson or you want to be more likable, you can always start your conversation off with good news. The opposing idea would be, I live, in the Detroit area. So if you were to start off a conversation about the Detroit Lions, that's probably a bad idea, right? For me, if you're selling to me. So people will like you more if you start off with good news. The second thing is, this is a very interesting one. People like you more if you like them. So if you're selling to a customer that you don't like, this is not going to work out well for you in many cases, right? People like you more if you like them. I think if you think about extroverts in sales, right? Part of the reason why liking an extrovert is so much easier is typically by nature being an extrovert, they like people, right? If you were an extrovert and you didn't like people, that'd be a very challenging life, right? But for the most part, people will like you more if you like them. Just on a side note on that extrovert introvert thing in sales, they found that extroverts are not more successful in sales, that introverts can be just as successful. In fact, the most successful people are people that really don't identify as either. And I think it's because the salesperson is really more engaged with the success of the customer, right, regardless of their personality around introversion and extroversion. So anyhow, the second one is a very interesting one. People like you more if you like them. And then this liking area has got this one way to kind of create a halo effect to increase your likability. And the way you do it is by getting people who like you all together. And examples of this, you can see here from the book, but I think in sales, like one that's you see all the time, at least pre-COVID, was when a salesperson gets a number of customers and prospects together in the suite of a sporting event, right? Why are they doing that? Well, they're getting all of these people that probably like the salesperson in an environment together, creating a halo effect for greater likability, right? So that's an example in sales that you see very often, or you did at least before COVID. There's a sales axiom out there: people buy from people they like. I cannot tell you how important this sales axiom is. It's probably the most likely indicator of win probability on an opportunity. And sure, product strength and things like that are very important, right? If your product just dominates your competitor's product, sure. But if all things are close to equal, people will buy from people they like. So this liking part of influence is super important in B2B sales. The next one is authority. Those with expertise or power, like a doctor is kind of an example, or the trappings of power, and we're just going to be like fancy cars, fancy suits, things like that, wield more influence. This is very interesting. You see salespeople use this one all the time. Why does a salesperson bring their founder into a sales call, or their CEO, or some person up the authority chain, right? It's because a person of authority is coming in, and that person is going to wield more influence on the discussion. Another way that salespeople do this are by looking more powerful or have more authority. And I can tell you in our, even at SAP, before I left a couple of years ago to start To Whom, you would see us in suits all the time. Why was that, right? Because that suit kind of gives this appearance of authority that has an influence over people, right? Their natural tendency is to be influenced by these people of authority. And so the last one that Cialdini brings up is scarcity. And this is the idea that rare items seem to be more desirable, right? So why aren't there an infinite number of every type of Beanie Baby, right? Because that scarcity makes them more desirable. Why doesn't Apple release enough of their iPhone 12, right, on the product release date? Because that scarcity is going to make that iPhone seem more desirable. In sales, enterprise sales in particular, you see us doing this all the time, right? So why do we have a quarter-end deal, right? That deal's going to go away if you don't make a decision by the end of the month, right? On the first of the month, that's off the table. Why? Why would we do that? Because it creates this scarcity concept, and that can influence people to buy something. So really, if you look at these influencing techniques, marketing and salespeople are using these tools of persuasion all the time. And I underline this because they're really tapping into your natural tendencies, right? They're doing things that are tapping into your psychology. You're naturally gravitating to that type of influence. And the outcome of that is emotion comes into decision-making far more than people would think. Everybody on this call probably has countless examples of maybe someone selecting an inferior product, or how did I end up buying that thing, or whatever, right? It's because emotion comes into play. And the reason emotion comes into play is it's very tough to stay rational with these persuasion tools. And I'll say, as a person, I'm kind of more like Mr. Spock than I am Captain Kirk, right? But even I will fall for some of this sometimes and have to recognize that, hey, I'm falling for these persuasion techniques as opposed to staying rational during a decision-making process. And the reason why I say sometimes this book is a little frightening to me is in a political season, an election year, right? Like staying rational through all of this stuff that's coming to a citizen who's trying to make a voting decision is very, very difficult. So I have empathy for folks. Because these folks are tapping into our natural tendencies. But I find it very interesting, the effect that we have in terms of our persuasion. And so I'm just going to add this to Sales 101. People are persuaded to buy your product, and the motivation is to be happier, right? So let's take a look at this. We started with customers buy your product. We're going to transform that into people are persuaded to buy your product to be happy. Okay, so this is Sales 101. I'm not sure if there's anything in the chat window because I can't see it, but this is a good time to take any questions on Sales 101. I'm going to jump to enterprise sales now. They're all correlated, of course, but I'll just take a pause and see if Regina comes off mute, which I don't see, so I'm going to continue on.
Actually, I have a question, Bucky.
Oh, okay.
Since we're on 101, just from your own personal kind of story, when you started your career, did you know that you would go into sales? Or is this something that one can train for? Or is it something that your kind of life path leads to? Like, how does...
Yeah, I did not. I got into sales. I was an engineer, and I was on the delivery side of some engineering capabilities to help manufacturing customers. And I worked for a software company, and the salesperson had business challenges, or I mean, personal challenges one time, and I was asked to kind of fill in, and I filled in, and I was so, I love the idea that I was helping a customer fix their business problem. There was something that really resonated with me about, you know, all of these business challenges people had. And I was like, what if I could be the salesperson that I wish I had, right? I'm not going to be some backslapping, take you out to have 4 martinis at lunch kind of sales guy. I'm actually going to help you with your business problem. I'm going to give that a shot, you know, and if it doesn't work out, I'll go back to being an engineer. That'd be great. And had a lot of success, as you can imagine, during the times, and I've really loved it. I really loved having that opportunity to work with customers, and I have a lot of friends because of that. And I would say that, like, the thing about going into the profession of sales is sales is a very experience-based, trade-like profession. You cannot read how to be a good salesperson and then become one just because you read it. There's a lot of things you have to experience in sales, and there's a lot of unknowns. One of the unknowns going into sales, an example, is how a person who goes into sales is psychologically affected by having a quota. Because a quota, as an example, your annual quota for as many as 360 days of the year, you might not be at your quota, and then you might be the best salesperson in the, you know, at the company that year, right? And then as soon as the first day of the fiscal year starts again, you're at 0. It's a very weird world to live in, right? You're almost never successful compared to your goals in a certain way. So there's lots of weird things about sales. So I didn't plan on getting into sales. It kind of happened that the opportunity presented itself to me, and I tried it out and I loved it. And so I've been there ever since.
Wonderful. Awesome. And you're one of the most seasoned sales executives I know. So I'm glad you did. All right. I'll let you be now.
All right.
Yeah. Right.
So let's talk about enterprise sales for a second now. So we've got these kind of, let's call them tools on our left to influence people. And we've got the people on the right who potentially are going to buy our product to be happier. How often has the person on the right bought our product? And very often that answer is never, right? Sometimes it's maybe once or twice, but that is not their core capability, to, you know, say the least. The next question is, well, how often do you persuade these people to buy your product if you're a salesperson? And the answer is that's your job, right? Like, you do that all the time. And so from an enterprise sales perspective, who should control the buying process? I think this is very interesting. The answer is definitely the salesperson, right? But it's very interesting when you see maybe lesser quality salespeople in the enterprise, or inexperienced, right? They don't have to be lesser quality, they just might not be used to doing this yet, right? Kind of letting the customer drive the process or not having a next action item. So I'd say in enterprise sales, we're going to talk a little bit about controlling the buying process here. And so I'll just say there's tremendous process complexity. I'm going to just bring up 3 kind of big ones, but there's all sorts of complexity around this process. So let's talk about the first one, the buying committee. If you're a Gartner Chief Sales Officer fan I am. They talk about the 2020 priorities as an example. and they talk about selling solutions in the enterprise, these buying committees keep getting bigger, right? There's more people who are influencing a decision inside the companies we're selling to. And I think this is kind of a effect of it. These decisions are becoming non-linear, right? The decision making and influencing are entering the buying process at different times. And so in the old days, you had kind of this like straightforward process you were trying to lead a customer through. It's not as easy anymore. There's more players that are entering at different times. A mistake that a lot of sales folks make potentially is looking at the org hierarchy as it is the authority in the account. And it's very funny. I still see sales organizations like, what's the org chart? And it's a false question, right? That's not the actual question. The question is, who's got influence, who's got authority, who's the economic buyer or veto, or what we call the whom to whom, right? Who is that ultimate decision maker? Who's influencing them? That's the buying committee, right? Sometimes these buying committee members may not even be inside the organization that you're selling to. I remember as a salesperson, whenever we'd have a product demo, the demo person would be demoing our functionality, our capability. We'd be trying to associate it to the value or the happiness of the customer. And what I'd be doing as a salesperson is I would be watching the crowd, right? And I would always, probably the fourth, fifth, sixth time we were doing this for a different customer, see the person sitting in the back, not around anyone, very attentive. And that person could never make it to the coffee line at the break without me escorting them. And why is that? Is because I was hunting for who's got the influence and authority, right? Why is that person sitting there? They probably don't know folks. Maybe they're an outside person who's wielding authority, right? So your great salespeople are always looking for this kind of influence and authority on the deals. And very often it does not equal org hierarchy. The other interesting thing about the buying committee is all of those people that could be on the buying committee are in different roles, right? And so their happiness, their business happiness or value from your product is going to be different, right? So imagine this now, you've got this buying committee that's growing in size. Their happiness for each one of those buying committee members could be different, right? And as a salesperson, you got to be figuring that out. The funny thing about this is I love technology. I founded a software company with Michelle. And if you think about like Zoom info, LinkedIn, artificial intelligence, machine learning, heck, you could have the best crystal ball in the world. It's not going to figure it out for you. When I was starting up in sales, they were like, if you're going to be a salesperson, you got to be like Columbo, right? For folks on the call, maybe, you're John Luther fan or whoever your latest CSI investigator is, but that's really what you need to be in sales, right? You need to be a person that can investigate who could have the influence, who could have the authority, what kind of happiness are they going to derive from my solution or product, right? Hey, do I need to bring more people into this decision-making process? And that's your real strength of great salespeople. And these tools aren't going to help you do that. They're going to give you hints. They might make it even easier for you, but they're not going to do it for you. Your salesperson has to do that. Another area of complexity is our customers' internal buying process. The reason why I think this is so complex is it's usually unknown at the startup pursuit, right? You typically enter through one person. It may be veto, economic buyer, whom, maybe a lower level person. It might even be some person that's not part of the buying committee in the future, right? But you're starting somewhere. It's very rare that that person actually has a complete understanding of their own buying process, right? And if you bring in the nonlinear complexity of people coming in all the time, this buying process now has become a real problem for sales folks, right? I just said on the previous slide, the salesperson should control the buying process, but the customer's internal buying process is even getting more complex. So this is a very challenging thing for sales folks. And then I'll just say the third area that I think is a fun one to consider with you in enterprise sales is the salesperson's ability, I'm going to call it, to manage up, right, internally. And I just took like Salesforce's default stages in their opportunity object, right? And you can see them here. The purpose of this isn't to go through these, but there are 9 of them right there. And for our customers, maybe the process is longer or shorter, right? That we're tracking inside of CRM. And I guess the thing for a salesperson is, let's say I'm a salesperson, I'm managing 50 opportunities. I have to be able to tell my sales leadership if the opportunity is in, let's say I've got an in value proposition, I have to be able to explain why it's not in needs analysis and why it's not in ID decision makers. And I didn't come up with this process, somebody else did, right? And so if you think about a salesperson's life, a lot of what they do is kind of managing up, right? They have to be able to talk about why their deal is in a certain place. And this is complex, right? Their sales leadership team's got many, many deals they're looking at. The salesperson has many deals they're looking at. And as a salesperson, worst case scenario is you don't know why you have it in value proposition, right? That's kind of a career limiting move in sales. So this is very complex. But there are things we can do to control this. And so Michelle and I founded To Whom to really address this complexity, right? To Whom specializes in kind of not only identifying what an optimal buying committee looks like, but also how to manage people through the process of it. When we start talking to a prospect or a customer and we point out just how bad their analysis is of their buying committees they're selling to, our customers kind of freak out, right? It's a scary moment. We have customers in certain cases that have connected with less than 10% of these economic buyers they should be selling to, and they don't like finding that out. The great news is To Whom manages that and will take care of them and help them get better at it. And the potential for revenue is extraordinary. So this is what we specialize. We specialize in kind of this buying committee management and managing the process of the buying committee. And it's super helpful to our customers. I would say to manage the customer's buying process, this is one thing that I've always looked for with great salespeople. And you definitely see the very good salespeople do this. It's kind of a documented evaluation plan with the customer. And this can be called many different things. I've heard it called a mutually agreed to plan. It's any sort of thing, but the idea is, as a sales company, you know there are a certain number of steps you need to complete to get your customer live with your product, right? So what are those steps? We could tell the customer this on the first meeting. Hey, when we work with customers, this is typically the process we see. On our side, here's the folks that are going to be responsible. As a sales guy, I'm going to be responsible for these. I'm going to bring in my solution engineer for this. I'm going to bring in my finance person for that, right? So I'm going to be saying, hey, here's my cast of characters. Who's your cast of characters, customer? We're going to figure this out with your prospect. We're going to figure out who's responsible on your side for all of these. When is this due, right? And customer, this is going to be your due date, right? We can flex this and agree to it, but let's figure out how we're going to execute this project and what's the status of this step. And there's lots of things happening from an influence and persuasion thing. Cialdini would be very proud of just even this evaluation plan. Just asking who's responsible right here in your second meeting with a prospect is going to start figuring out who's in this buying committee, right? If we have these steps and we need these types of people, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, who are they, right? As a salesperson in the second meeting with a customer, I can be figuring out what does this buying committee look like. You want to control scarcity? Let's put this due date right around our quarter end, right? And so anyhow, I can talk about many, many ways we use this evaluation plan, but it should be a document that's living and breathing with your customer that's managing the buying process for them. My experience with prospects and customers are they love this, right? And why do they love it? Because they're not experts at buying this, your product, right? They're not experts, you are. So most customers love the fact that you have this documented process to help guide them through achieving the benefits they're going to get when they use your product. So one little note, I had one salesperson stop at contract signature date, right? And I was like, very nice. That's important to us, because we're selling this, but to the customer, right, it's actually live or even past live when they're starting to gain benefit from the solution. So always make sure you're taking these eval plans at least out to some form of a live date or some point in time when they're gaining benefit from your product. And then managing up, right? I would just say that sometimes sales leadership could do a much better job on asking reps for what is the sales artifact that would make you prove to me that you're moving from one stage to another, right? So if I'm in value analysis and the previous stage was needs analysis, I would say, hey, rep, the only way you can go to value analysis is if you show me the needs analysis, right? There should be a sales artifact from the previous stage to prove that you accomplished this, right? Sales leaders don't do a great job very often in making sure that there's some form of a sales artifact moving from stage to stage. Don't think of that as like a gate or some sort of a pain for the salesperson. It's just really there to say, look, you know, we accomplished this stage with this customer and we did the work, right? So it's very straightforward. And then I'll say one thing that you see out of maybe the greatest salespeople is managing their manager, right? And they're kind of the best at making sure when they want the manager to see the great work they're doing to get that manager involved in their deal. On the flip side, they can also be very good at kind of camouflaging those things they don't want folks to see, right? And you've kind of heard the analogy of, you know, making sausage. You don't really want to see that if you want to eat sausage, right? And so you see great salespeople kind of keeping their managers out of the mess they don't want them to see until they want them to see it. There's a little asterisk with this one too. If you're not a very good salesperson and you try to manage your manager, you're probably about 90 days out from finding a new manager. So managers don't like that, except in the case when you're a really good salesperson, but it's an important part of being a good salesperson. So we've now covered enterprise sales. I'm not sure if there's a question from anyone on enterprise sales. Just kind of keep my eye out to see if someone comes off mute there. But with enterprise sales, we've said, look, we had these tools, right? These influencing capabilities on the left for the people that were going to be happy after they used our product. We now, from an enterprise sales, have established our control of the buying process, right? Very important from great sales folks. What do we say to these folks, right? And this is really what value selling is all about. So let's take a look at value selling. The first thing about value selling is it really needs to be by persona. Maybe you've heard kind of this kind of persona-based selling. This is important for us at To Whom when we think about the buying committee because it's selling to a persona. But if you have a product line in your arsenal that is sold to the CFO, right, that is different than selling to the chief procurement officer. And their problems and the implications and everything, much different. So first thing is you really need to know the persona that's typically going to be the economic buyer, veto, or whom that you're selling to. I would argue that if you're really doing a good job, you probably want to do this by industry, and there's an easy way to point this out. Let's say we're selling to CFOs. Our solution resonates with CFOs. They gain the value. Is the CFO of General Motors' job the same as the CFO of Salesforce's? Right? They almost couldn't be much different. In certain ways, it's like, are they even doing the same job, right? A capitally intensive type of company, like a GM or a Ford compared to a software company, very different. And so industry is really an important part of value selling. Now, when you're starting to sell value to your customer, to your prospect, there's really kind of three things you need to do before you ever start talking, right? So the first thing is, what types of problems does this persona have? And it should be in context of your product somehow, right? Because eventually your product's going to alleviate that pain or provide additional pleasure, right? So what's the problem they have in context to our company, right, that we're selling for? And then that problem needs to get broke down into two different ways: financial, and I'll always say people, right? And we'll talk more about this, but financial is this kind of what financial impacts, right? Are we reducing costs, increasing revenue, and what's the people implications of that problem? And then what kind of outcomes happen when that problem gets solved? These would be your case studies, right? Like, hey, this customer solved this problem, they gained this kind of benefit. This is pre-work before you say one word to this type of persona. So what do you say to this persona, right, when you finally get that chance? well, look, we got these great features, an exciting founder, cool HQ with pinball machines, great investors. Our solution really is a market disruptor. And can we be honest? It's the next platform. So everyone step away from the sales and marketing narcissist mirror, right? We have to translate those features into value and happiness. And this is what we want to talk to with our prospects, right? How do our capabilities bring value to their organization? And this is tough for a lot of organizations, especially as the organization gets bigger, because when you think about marketing, they need to talk about product a little. It's just the way it is for marketing. And so you'll see marketing content very often on the website or in collateral that we deliver and things. But once you're starting to have a conversation with this persona or someone on their buying committee, it really needs to be translated to them. A lot of times this work of translating feature to value or happiness is left in the salesperson's hands. This is great work for the enterprise or for anyone on this call to do with their organization. If you can help arm your salesperson with this value and happiness, instead of asking them to do the work, it's very important. We have a concept called first conversation into whom, where we're trying to have our sales leaders translate marketing information into conversation information right here. And this is a big deal for sales organizations. I will say in value selling, and we haven't spent much time on this so far in the presentation around competitors, this is the time to start setting landmine for competitors. And you have to remember in sales, folks forget this sometimes, that you think, or some folks think, right, they're selling their product to these people or to a customer, right? But the reality is so are other folks. And you're actually competing against them. And most often, only one of you is going to land that sale, right? So you have a chance of losing. So while this conversation is going on, this is the time to set competitive landmines, right? You know the value that your competitor can't deliver, or you know you deliver extra value. And if you can deliver this extra value, you need to make sure that's the most important decision-making criteria, right, for your prospect, because it differentiates you from your competitor. So it's really important when you start developing these value and happiness conversations, right, that you also include competitive landmines. We talked about it earlier, or at least I mentioned it, right, this concept of selling to excel. And you hear this out in the industry, but I think it's a fun way of putting it. If you can't translate this feature to some sort of value that's quantified either in reducing costs or increasing revenue, very hard to get justification to purchase your thing, right, your product. And so I would say this selling to excel is this idea that you should always be able to explain how you're benefiting someone in an Excel spreadsheet. And that does not sound very sexy, and I'm sorry for that, but from a business perspective, that's very important, right? If you can explain how your solution is impacting someone in Excel, reducing costs, increasing revenue, right, win probability is going way up. Having said that, do not ignore soft people outcomes, right? Any of the things that these companies are considering do are going to have people implications. And if you can talk about those ahead of time, you can really benefit your customer. And it could provide great benefits to these people that they want to do. Sometimes that gets overlooked because people can get a little too focused on the financial value. But I think if it is going to have a negative impact on the people and you bring it up front, you become more trustworthy. If it's going to have a positive impact on these people, you might as well take credit for it, right? So don't ignore the soft people outcomes. And I'll just say there's no reason why you should be providing an ROI starting at the first meeting, right? And this may be embedded in your case studies in your first meeting, or you may call it out explicitly. But the deal is you have some number of assumptions about how your product is adding value to your customers, whether it's reducing costs or increasing revenue, right? Make those assumptions and make them clear to the customer. What you'll do with your customer is you'll work on this ROI over time. So they'll tell you your first one is wrong. Great, it is wrong. Let's make it better, right? And you'll make it better over time, continue to improve this ROI. Eventually, as a salesperson, from a persuasion perspective, you want this buyer to own the ROI. It should be their ROI, right? You're making modifications, the assumptions and parameters, so eventually that ROI is the one that they believe in. That's very critical, right, for completing a sale. So I would say, please, you know, these ROIs, when you're getting into sales, there's no reason to be afraid of them. A lot of times sales folks are afraid because they're wrong on day one. That's fine. Acknowledge that they're wrong and let's make them better, right? They're very important to sales. Okay, so in conclusion, what did we talk about? We talked about sales 101, right? People are persuaded to buy your product to be happy. Very important sales axiom there, right? We talked about enterprise sales. How are your great salespeople managing buying committees? How are they managing the buying process? How are they managing their own internal processes? And then from a value selling, we said, let's make sure we're really tailoring this message to the persona we're selling to and their problem, right? Let's talk about financial and people outcomes, and don't be afraid of ROIs when you're value selling. You should start with them, know they're wrong, make them better. We didn't get into this, but I put it in the middle, and it's objection handling. And I think whenever you see a job request for a salesperson, and it starts off with 5+ years experience, 10+ years experience, in certain roles at SAP, we had 15+ years experience. Why do they want that experience? And this is really it. It's objection handling. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, sales is an interesting profession because it's part trade. You know, you kind of have to bump into these objections a number of times before you get good at handling them. The problem is when you don't handle them very well live in front of a customer, you can lose the deal, right? And so as great salespeople get better and better at objection handling, it really kind of ties all this together, and it's that final piece of the puzzle to being a great salesperson. And so with that, I'm Bucky Strong again. It's been a great chance to be on with y'all and talk about sales, one of my favorite things. And I'm open for questions if folks have some questions.
Yeah, there's a couple that came in.
All right.
And folks, feel free to chime in. Lindy, you as well, but I'm going to read those out. How long does your team's average sales cycle take?
Sales cycles are definitely dependent on the product and the segment you're selling to. And this is true even for Teum, as well as that's every place I've been. So if you're selling into the enterprise, your sales cycle is going to be longer. You have two different portions of the enterprise sale. If you think about it, you kind of have the getting the buying committee to believe that your product is the right thing to do. Once you get to that point, you're about to engage in their purchase process, their formal purchase process. That can take a long time. And it just is what it is, right? It depends on the company you're selling to. And, you know, we kind of at To Whom spend some time around the contact side of SFA or CRM, which brings GDPR into play potentially for our customers. And, you know, they want to be very careful of that, right? So our sales cycle can get a little longer on that. So to answer your question, it really depends on the segment size you're calling on, because enterprise deals are going to be longer. And then from a product perspective, if you think about To Whom, we can describe our value to our customer very quickly, 1 or 2 meetings, right? If you think about selling SAP financials to a financial organization, that could take 25 meetings, right? Before all of this, you know, super complex functionality exposes itself to the people that need to. Just getting them to the point at SAP where they think that that financial solution is the right thing for them takes way longer than it takes us at To Whom to get people to understand how we can provide value. So your product, that drives sales cycle length, and the segment that you're calling on drives sales cycle length. And there's no like one size fits all sales cycle depending on what you're selling and who you're selling to.
All right. And then there's another question, which is, do your enterprise customers prefer annual or monthly payments? I think this could be a general question for enterprise in general. Like, what should you go for? Multi-year, annual, or?
I think this is kind of more of the Columbo or John Luther type of question. You as a salesperson want to figure that out, right, with your customer. They have different choices. I would say that most of the software companies that I've worked for the software team is on an annual plan and they want to annualize that purchase because it fits in with their compensation plan really well. So you'll see a lot of software sales organizations prefer the annual purchase. It also gets them their money up front, right? So they're kind of prepaying for it. So that's why you see such a push for annual. But to your question, I think from a customer perspective, it can be different, and it's good to find out if you're a salesperson.
Cool. And as a follow-up to that, and there's a bunch of others that have come in, but what do you think on pricing? Like, how flexible should salespeople be on pricing? Like from a discount standpoint, and how do you?
Yeah, pricing is very product specific too, because in software, where you're hosting your own software, so to speak, a multi-tenant environment, let's use Salesforce as an example, right? They know what their fixed costs are against that product being sold. After that, kind of, if you think about R&D and things like that, some of that's sunk cost, right, that they're already doing. So on the software side, if you look at financial statements for software companies, that's why their margins are so high, right? However, if you're GM and you're selling a car, you have these huge capital costs that are associated with that car. And now you're basically paying for just the raw material that makes that car, right, to have a sale. The reason why I'm bringing up these two different things are what every company knows is what their floor price is, right? If I go below floor, I know I'm losing money, right? For public companies, it also drives revenue recognition, right? So you can't just go discounting things willy-nilly, or you start having revenue recognition problems at your larger public companies. So with that in mind, my perspective from discounting is you usually want to use discounting either to beat a competitor or to drive the customer to purchase on a time frame you want them to purchase on. The third case now that I'll say that I'm a founder of a startup is, we're kind of searching around, not as much for product market fit, but to see what our perceived value is to our customer. I mean, I ask every customer this before I give them a price at this point. Hey, what do you think it's worth, right? And that's because as a startup, I'm trying to figure out what the perceived value is of my product. But once you have an established price point, I think you use discounting to drive those two things: beat a competitor or get your deal done sooner than the customer wants to do it.
Great. Okay, the next question is, what is the most difficult objection you've had to deal with? And Jennifer, feel free to chime in, but the follow-up question for what should we be asking you, is that?
Hi, this is Jennifer. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
They're actually kind of two separate questions. I often find with meeting with folks, as the expert, there's probably questions that we're just not thinking of that, in the back of your mind, gosh, if they really wanted to get into it, or a great question would be, or I could offer a really insightful answer if someone just asked me that. So they're actually really two different questions.
So the first one on the objection side, and then Jennifer, give me the second one again. I would say the most challenging objections are, so there's kind of another axiom in sales: perception is truth. Truth isn't truth. The customer's perception of what's going on is the actual truth. So in sales, what's very hard is when you get an objection that's a perception-based objection and it's not the truth, right? And you're trying to take the customer from their current perception to the truth. I think those are the hardest ones, because you have to be very careful understanding how the prospects misaligned with the truth. And you can't punch them in the face with the truth. It does not work. The customer has to discover the truth for themselves. So when you get an objection where their perception is off from the truth, you always have to start by trying to figure out why is their perception off, and how do I get them on the path to finding truth again. So I would say those are probably the trickiest objection handles, because very often they're political inside of the business, right? Somebody is actually not interested in finding the truth, right? Or something. You may have to take that person and set them off as a detractor and try and, discredit them from the influencing committee if you know that they're trying to break down a buying process for, let's just call them reasons that aren't good, right? Political reasons for whatever that might be. And so, Jennifer, I would say those are kind of the objections that are the hardest, is these where perception doesn't equal truth. And now we have to start figuring out what we're going to do with the person that has the perception that's off. How was that?
No, that's great. Thanks. I agree. Perception as reality is definitely a tough one. And, got to find those biases. The second one, I think you said you wanted me to repeat that. Is that right?
Did you say you had a second one?
It's more of a general one, but I often find it's very helpful to ask, what should we be asking you? Because a lot of times, whether I'm being interviewed or whatnot, that's something I've often thought of. If they only asked me this, I could give them this really insightful or whatever. So I just thought, what should we be asking you? What would be the most, what has caught you by surprise, or what do you wish someone had told you when you're going into some of your tough ones?
Thanks, Jennifer.
Good sales question. It's a good sales question.
Thanks.
That
Thanks.
I think the thing that's most important, maybe if I kind of answer the unasked question, is your customer is more important than everything, right? Like why they're making a decision, how you can help them make it. It's all about them. And too often in sales and marketing, we make it all about us. And I really was very serious about that product thing, right? We just fall in love with our product so often. And I think the longer, a company is out in the market, the more they fall in love with their own product, right? And it's not about our product, it's about solving the customer's problem. So I guess if there's one thing that I would say that I can't scream from the top of the mountain a lot, and sometimes it even sounds cliche, but it's really, really not. These people that you're working with at your customer, they want to make their company and their role and their function better. If you can help them do that, everybody's happier, right? And that's really what we should be trying to do in sales. And you're trying to figure out, how does your product achieve that end customer goal? So Jennifer, that would be mine, is really focus on that customer, and not from a cliche perspective, but really they're trying to be happier in their role. How do we help them become happier? And how does our product help them do that? If we do that as salespeople, and we manage some of the complexity of the buying process for them because we're experts with that, our customers tend to love us.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. All righty, Shariah. Well, this kind of sounds like me 10 years ago. I've had to work on it. I'm naturally introverted, but the question is, I am a naturally quiet, introverted person, and I sometimes worry when I need to be on in sales meetings, it will come across as disingenuous because it's not my natural mode. Any suggestions to work on that?
Yes. I have been accused of that as well, actually. At times, I'm a, what would you call it, like a very strong listener.
Mm-hmm.
I would just say stand tall and believe in yourself and put that aside. I think one of the things that I probably worked on in my earlier years as a professional were two things. One, just trying to engage in maybe, can we just call it chit chat kind of things, maybe a little more, because I wanted to take that perception off of me. The other thing that, in terms of people being more likable, I ended up having to share more about myself, just personally, right, with folks as I was meeting them. I was, a little less inclined to just talk about anything with anybody. And I think that was probably, years 0 through 3 in my sales career, where just being a little more of an open book, talking about myself personally a little bit more, that kind of broke down. And if you look at me on like the introversion scale, I'm kind of right in the middle on it. I do tend some, Myers-Briggs put me in extroverted. Sometimes you'll see me lean introverted. But I would just say, you know, have confidence in yourself. That's not a weakness. It just is, you know, something that I'm betting you're probably a great listener because of that, right? And that can be a huge strength in sales. And then if you did want to, again, kind of work on, if you think that's negatively impacting your likability, right? A couple of things you can do is just at the beginning of a meeting, you know, introduce yourself and learn more about a person. And then this one was very interesting feedback. I started sharing more about myself, you know, it gave the perception I was less introverted or more engaged. It maybe is a even better way of saying it. Yeah.
All righty, cool. Well, we're at the top of the hour. Time flew by. Thank you again. Unless folks have any other questions.
Yeah, you can always track me down too. One of those 3 ways in the bottom left. I'm a sales guy by heart, so I love talking with folks. And if anyone wants to chase me down, I'd love to continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah,
It's
great.
awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bucky, for your time.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.
Very
It's a
much.
great session. Thank you. Thanks all for joining. Take care.